Rachel, James, update on my house renovation or kitchen renovation is it's all going well. Progress is happening. We had the electrician round a couple of days ago, and last night at about 9 o'clock, obviously all the lights went out and the freezer in the basement went out. So I had to save all the food from the freezer, move it to the fridge upstairs, into the other freezer, etc., move it around. And it got me thinking, in an emergency in your house, what would be the one thing that you'd save?
I think the correct answer would be my wife.
Hi, welcome to Agonomics with me, David Udall, a man my wife, my chérie amour, knows very well. The aim of this weekly podcast from AHDB is to help farmers and other levy payers understand the economics of agriculture a little better. And if I had a mantra, it would be along the lines of, don't get uptight, everything's all right, when armed with a little knowledge. In this show, I'll be exploring the link between retailers and the environment, and how much of a bearing it has on imports, specifically beef and lamb. It follows on from work we did last year, comparing beef and lamb farm assurance schemes around the world. And I'll be joined by colleagues to look at some schemes that include environmental standards in Ireland, New Zealand and Australia. Hopefully we can build a global picture of how retailers view farm assurance from an environmental perspective. Don't be a part-time lover, become a regular listener. So please follow and subscribe to this podcast to make sure you don't miss an episode. New shows drop Wednesdays at midday, and please get in touch. Comment on any of AHDB's social channels or send us an email. Signed, sealed, delivered, I'm yours. To agonomics@ahdb.org.uk. We've been releasing a lot of new material, as ever with AHDB. So we spoke about our dairy outlook and our beef and lamb market outlook, and our pork outlook has been released, and cereals and oilseeds is coming up as well. So a lot of fantastic content coming out from the teams there. And mentioning cereals and oilseeds, another thing that we've done is revised the structure of our weekly market report to make it a bit more succinct and a bit more impactful. So looking for feedback on that, of the changes. Been well received in parts and seen it used in different ways so far, which is really good. Obviously, we want to continually develop what we do, but we've been looking at sector outlooks recently, and we're going to move away from those to look at something that's a bit more bigger picture in the beef and lamb sector. And we're going to be talking about environment and environmental schemes and how it links to assurance and retailers. So kind of a bit of a multifaceted conversation. And so because of that, we need two experts in the room. Not just myself. I'm not counting myself as an expert within this at all. We have James Taylor, who's our head of farm assurance, and Rachel Madeley-Davis, who is our head of environment, covers all matters of technical things within it. So we're going to talk about a few different things, and we're going to, have a lot of different conversations around it. And we may go off on a tangent, but, we'll see where we go. So, James, I was going to come to you first, because this is from a specific piece of work that we've created, isn't it? So the reason that we're here is we've done a specific piece of work, and it kind of instigated this conversation where we said it's a little bit complex. We don't want to just lump it on our website and go and abandon it. We need to treat it with a bit of love. And that's what we're here to do today, is give it a bit of love and talk about it in a bit of detail. So do you want to just explain what that work is and what we've done, and then we can kind of talk about the impact of it and what it is and what it means.
Yes, David. Hi. So this work builds on some comparison reports which we commissioned last year in 2024, which compares red tractor standards with baseline assurance schemes in the beef and lamb sector around the world. And what it found was that red tractor generally scored higher overall than other baseline schemes. And I came into my role last summer in about June time and read the first report, which compared red tractor with baseline schemes in Australia and New Zealand. And there was quite a gap, especially with the Australian baseline scheme. And I was keen to sort of know, well, do retailers put any extra requirements over and above those baseline schemes when they import beef and lamb? And that was especially from the perspective of the environment, because environmental enhancement was out of scope of those reports that we did last year. So we commissioned this additional bit of work for the consultants, Burney Consultancy, who did those baseline scheme comparisons, just to speak to retailers. So a completely different methodology to what they did in the other schemes, which was more sort of desktop work. And this was to speak to retailers, and to basically ask them, well, how do you view assurance in New Zealand, Australia, and we added Ireland because of its proximity and the volume of red meat imported, and what extra requirements do you put over and above those baseline schemes? And that was in the context of environmental schemes, which we asked them to consider. So there's 3 different schemes in New Zealand, Australia, and Ireland, which were compared.
I mean, the reason for doing this, James, is because this is quite a technical thing we're starting to talk about. There's a lot of nuance within this, and it isn't as simple as just looking at it from the black and white written word. We need to spend a bit of time explaining it, don't we, really, and kind of getting into the detail of it. Don't worry, we're not doing page by page. We're not going to sit here reading out the report verbatim, but we do kind of need to get to the conclusion of it and then kind of discuss what that then means. I suppose the main question that I have is, from the evidence that we found, how do retailers view farm assurance from an environmental perspective?
In general, there's a relatively low level of satisfaction amongst retailers with the environmental reassurances that are offered by the existing widely used baseline schemes, both in the UK and internationally, from the perspective of reduced greenhouse gas emissions or improved biodiversity on the farm. So we asked them in this to consider these 3 enhanced schemes, which are the Sustainable Beef and Lamb Borbia scheme in Ireland, which is actually their main baseline scheme, but the environmental component is integrated into it. The New Zealand Farm Assurance Programme Plus, NZFAP Plus in New Zealand, which is a bolt-on to their baseline scheme, and then the AgCare in Australia, which is a standalone scheme. So three sort of different models. When retailers considered the 3 schemes compared to the study, most were aware of the environmental data collected in Ireland through the SPLS, LAS, and suggested this is probably the most environmentally advanced assurance scheme in widespread use. But it was acknowledged that it's still predominantly a data collection exercise, and there's not necessarily an impact in terms of positive environmental activity on participating farms. In New Zealand, the NZFAP Plus is still in its early stages, and there's not yet enough critical mass for the sort of high volume UK retailers to obtain supply from only NZFAP Plus farms in New Zealand. Awareness of it was reasonable, but there aren't any retailers importing against that standard. The AgCare scheme in Australia is not widely recognised, and only a very small number of those spoken to had heard of it. Actually, it would be fair to say in Australia generally, although the baseline scheme called Livestock Production Assurance Scheme does place some controls around input use, in general Australia is seen as being behind the curve with regard to environmental assurance.
It's really interesting, isn't it, that some of that outcome is very much focused that they perceive it as a data collection rather than actually demonstrating actual action on farm. And I think particularly in this environmental space, that's probably some of the most interesting and perhaps valuable from a consumer perspective is actually what is actually happening in terms of action. So it is quite interesting in terms that, the focus is very much in terms of an advanced data collection rather than tangible outcomes.
And that's a challenge going forwards again, isn't it, in terms of the actual ask of what we're trying to achieve here, because it can easily lead you to a very sort of transactional element where people just provide data for the sake of data rather than anything that's, like you say, having an actionable impact on farm. And then it also leads you down the route of people just looking at from a global trade perspective to put it into that bigger picture. People just move stuff around based on numbers rather than actual kind of true environmental impact. And that's something that's, again, given the world is in a very sort of protectionist trade environment at the moment, thanks to a newfound fella who's got a job in America, then it's dangerous if that sort of trade protectionism spreads into these other areas and you see trade flows that are being impacted. And then, the data that's driving some of that trade is basically just on a very transactional means. It just ends up in a very complex arena with something that is potentially damaging to actual food trade flows as well.
Absolutely. And I think you miss out on some of those positive elements then. I think, and that's a problem when it becomes quite transactional. It always goes back to me, it's always about that reputational piece and actually in terms of perhaps what we're delivering. And I think that's when that sort of nuance can get lost, I think, when it becomes just like a data transaction. So
you were at COP last year, weren't you, Rachel, and kind of involved in some of the discussions over there? How big is, I suppose, the data side of the discussions going on there? Is this a sort of a broader discussion that happens within those environments, or is it something that's, we're having to sort of force the issue on?
data is sort of monumental, and I think in terms of growing, I think, and there's actually, as we know, there's so much power in data, but actually there's also a lot of risk around data as well in terms of how it's utilised. So I think in terms of that global stage, there's absolutely a key sort of opportunity here in getting and utilising data. But I think for me, it's always about bringing it back to the levy payer and farm action and actually what that means as well. So it's got to work both ways. So my big sort of thing is always about thinking globally but acting locally. And I think, data works that same way, and especially this sort of data. But we've always got to be, we've got to be careful in terms of, is it useful? What is it telling us? But also, is it driving the right actions? I think that's the key thing.
I know we're not here to talk about kind of just the data side of it specifically, but then you get into the areas about data security and data protection and the commercialisation of that data and how it's being used and the value of that, ensuring that that value is then passed on. It's kind of very much a dangerous area and a developing area that needs consideration. And when you put that into other areas of environmental markets and carbon markets that are still relatively in their embryonic stages for how they're actually properly structured, you can see how there's challenges within those markets and how there's, I suppose, pitfalls that people have been looking out for in terms of how data is used and the commercialisation of that data. And this, I suppose, from a perspective of one thing that we do as HDB, and especially using carbon markets and other environmental aspects as well, is very much around trying to provide that baseline foundational information so that farmers and levy payers are all aware of technicalities and issues, etc. So that actually we're not giving the answer of what people should do, which is making sure they're informed in their decision making about all of these things. Told you we're going to go off on a tangent, and we just did.
I think it does all interlink, though, doesn't it? And I think, and as the sort of the report sort of mentions, it talks about sort of data in terms of being anonymised, aggregated. And I think I'm a big advocate that sometimes that can be really useful at a certain level, provided that caveats exist. But I think, in terms of that data bit, it's just sometimes it's when it starts to lose or doesn't track the enhancement opportunity or the positive impact. And I think that's when we've got to be a bit more cautious, perhaps. Yeah,
aggregation is safe, but it's also dilution as well. And that's kind of the risk of it, isn't it? That we end up diluting and confusing matters because, again, you get to the point of, transactional views of data and we're just creating diluted transactional data, which is just a mass that doesn't actually tell you things that's kind of quite defined. Anyway, that's getting into a completely different tangent. James, bring us back on track with this. We were here talking about a report rather than talking about the specifics of transactional environmental data.
The report does say a lot about data, and generally retailers and other consultees feel that it's necessary to move from the monitoring of compliance against minimal legal legislation to sort of more active demonstration that beef and lamb has been farmed sustainably. In terms of the specific data requirements communicated by those consulted, it's around measuring and verifying carbon footprint, delivered to internationally agreed standards. Obviously, there's a lot of debate about what those standards should be, potentially leading to a selection of farms which are below a specific level. And secondly, about measuring baseline biodiversity performance, and then a whole load of ideas there about amounts and quality of habitat on the farm, range and frequency of birds, plant species, measuring soil quality and health, design and implementation of plans and activity, tailored specific farm, and ongoing and anonymous benchmarking of the whole supply chain. It's interesting because reading it with my tenant farmers, and we're in a high-level stewardship scheme, and some of these ideas for a baseline assurance scheme go way beyond what the government in the UK are currently asking for SFI or for HLS or horticultural stewardship. So there's a question about which the authors acknowledge about who pays and how this is sort of integrated so that it's not, as a farmer, we're not after the same information multiple times. But yeah, there's certainly a big issue on data. And then there are other needs expressed by retailers around, and some of this is sort of more aspirational than perhaps realistic in the short term, but about specific farm plans, evidence of continuous improvement. And then there's the issue of cost. And so when asked whether they're willing to pay more to affect the cost of environmental improvement on farm, the major issue identified was one of comparative cost of product and issues around critical mass. Several respondents stated that assurance should not be seen as a mechanism for retailers to lift existing standards without compensating farmers for the cost to achieve those enhanced standards. And it's obviously clear that the delivery of environmental benefits through assurance needs to be associated with financial return that outweigh the cost of compliance. whether that's a combination of direct payment for compliance standards, additional payment for compliant products, or to improve farm efficiency through adherence to those standards.
Thank you, James. I think this is the perfect time to give everyone's brains a rest, and we'll take a short break to get the latest on the market information, and then when we come back, we're going to be delving into this topic in slightly more detail with some more mind-bending conversations about data and environment and assurance.
Hi, I'm Annabelle Twinbarrow, analyst at the AHDB, here with a look at the domestic dairy market for the week commencing the 10th of February. GB milk deliveries have shown year-on-year growth since September, with the latest data for January showing a 2.2% increase in deliveries compared to January 2024. Season-to-date deliveries for this milk year are now up by 0.8%. This is marginally behind forecasts of the very cold snap in January, holding back production for a week or so. Favourable dairy economics have driven production growth during the winter months. Average farm gate prices reached 47.1 pence per litre according to DEFRA, and with feed costs at much more reasonable levels, the milk to feed price ratio is looking extremely favourable for continued growth in milk production as we approach the flush. Milk price announcements held steady to lower in February, falling back slightly but still positive. On retailer-aligned contracts, prices lowered but held for some. Waitrose and M&S held, but Co-op, Tesco and Sainsbury's declined. Non-aligned liquid contracts, cheese and manufacturing mostly held their prices this month. White Farms is the only contributor on the AHDB league table to make a positive price announcement of 0.2 pence per litre. You can read more about our production and price expectations for the year ahead in the Agri-Market Outlook for dairy and other sectors on our website. For the latest data and analysis on red meat, dairy and arable markets, head to ahdb.org.uk and click on Markets and Prices.
Pork.
British pork. Pork is sticky, pork is spicy, pork is air-fried, slow-cooked, baked. Pork is high in protein, low on cost. Pork is sauce around your chops. Pork is not just Sundays. Pork is midweek. Every week. This is British pork. But not as you know it. Pork is...
So we're back with part 2 of Agonomics, talking about environment, retail, farm assurance, and for once in my life, I'm going to make sure that we deliver this professionally, no messing around. I ain't going to stand for it. We're going to have something that's going to be valuable at the end of this. We're going to do this, and I'm giving some motivations because James, who's on the podcast, currently is unwell recording it. So this is my motivational speech for you, James. We're going to get through this. We're going to do it. We're going to make it happen. I'm going to ask you a question now. I'm going to put you on the spot after picking you up. We've spoken a lot about the report and what it says, and there's one key question which I don't think we've covered from that report about what it says about retailers' current sourcing behaviour and potential future sourcing behaviour as well.
It's interesting. So there's a lot of thought out there and intention for the future in terms of having enhanced environmental requirements throughout the supply chain, and which will influence importing decisions of red meat. But currently, no UK retailers require that product from New Zealand is assured to the NZ FAP Plus standards, which was reviewed, or to the AgCare standards in Australia. So that's quite interesting, although the NZ FAP Plus scheme in particular, awareness is quite high. It's well viewed of. There is a clear relationship between adherence to the scheme and action in terms of the actual difference it makes on farm, but retailers aren't importing against those standards. Almost all retailers that source from Ireland do require SBLAS assurance, but that's primarily on the basis that it's the only widely used assurance scheme in Ireland, rather than the fact that it collects environmental data. As I say, insurance of environmental improvement is highly desirable to the retailer, but there's various challenges around the measurement of Scope 3 carbon emissions, and even larger challenges around demonstrating good practice to enhance biodiversity. And as a result of that, retailers currently place very few environmental demands on their beef and lamb supply chains. Partly, I think, because it's currently not clear that a critical mass of qualifying farms would meet an environmental improvement criteria, certainly in any of those 3 countries considered in this report. there's a sort of distinct hierarchy of needs when retailers make beef and lamb sourcing decisions, and these can be broken down to essential criteria and desirable criteria. So essential, you've got sufficient availability of supply, assurance of product safety, the presence of farm assurance, the absence of environmental damage, the absence of supply chain abuse, and then desirable criteria are about risk mitigation, which include environmental factors and carbon and biodiversity in particular, provenance and storylines for consumers. So that's the current situation. But in terms of future sourcing behaviour, retailers are positioning themselves actively to demonstrate to consumers that they're being proactive in both carbon and biodiversity measures. Almost every retailer who engaged with this study indicated that they believe there will be a future requirement of assurance of environmental improvement underpinned by measurement and verification. As I say, this is not possible yet at scale and consequently doesn't form part of the sourcing specifications for beef and lamb at the moment. But once this option is possible and the critical mass is available, then it's likely to be immediately taken up. And the vast majority of respondents felt that low environmental performance will prevent access to retail markets in the next few years. We've talked a lot about data, that there are significant technical difficulties around the provision of accurate data to provide assurance of delivery of enhanced biodiversity, water quality, air quality and soil health. But the measurement of carbon performance appears to be more achievable, although as often discussed, the specific carbon analysis model used does need to be agreed. A final point about the different ways in which these schemes operate. So those consulted agree that the structure of any future assurance scheme is really important, and consideration should be given to whether environmental requirements are included as part of a main sort of baseline scheme, like in Ireland with the SBLAS approach, whether it should be as a bolt-on to basic assurance, as in New Zealand with the NZFAP plus, or whether it should be a completely standalone scheme, as it is the case with in Australia. But as I say, awareness and take up there is much lower than the other two countries.
Just that in itself is a significant amount of information and a significant amount of different things that we could talk about. And also there must be, I suppose the key thing that I'm worried about here really is, from a farmer levy payer listening to this, this is going to sound a lot, and this is going to sound potentially quite scary in terms of the sort of what if out there, in terms of how it could develop and the requirements that could be placed upon them, etc. And this is obviously something that we look at domestically, but this extends on a global scale as well. And this isn't anything that's disappearing at all. This isn't something where this is like we talk about cycles of commodity markets in terms of supply and demand. This isn't just going to be flushed away as soon as there's an increase in the supply of beef and everyone thinks that procurement's really easy again, so why do we need to worry about it? It isn't as simple as that. This is obviously around for the long term. And Rachel, I think from an AHDB perspective, there's a significant volume of work that we're doing on behalf of levy payers and for levy payers at the moment in this environmental scope, isn't there? And I think we should probably take a moment to actually just sort of discuss that and review that. This isn't just us trying to put an issue out there and sort of abandoning it, as I say. There is already a lot of ongoing work from our side to help progress and develop a lot of different areas in this sort of environmental sustainability discussion.
All the work that we're doing in terms of the environment team starts to interlink within this space. So if you just take, for example, just the baselining project, and actually fundamentally this is about baselines. It's about baseline data across whether it's carbon, whether it's biodiversity, whether it's soil health. It's all those individual things that start to create the foundations of these sort of schemes. And actually HDB's baselining project, which is now fully underway. And again, I could sort of overlay other work streams, so the beef and lamb roadmap, for example. Again, that starts to overlay some other credentials in terms of those environmental metrics at farm level. So I think the work that we're doing now and the work that we're planning to do going forward absolutely starts to underpin some of these things, because we're all on the same page. As a supply chain, as a sort of levy board, we all sort of want the same thing. And we're all working towards that. But I think my big thing, would be as a levy payer, and I'm saying this probably as a farmer as well, really, is it's remembering that we're really well placed. We're already doing this stuff. It's just about capturing the data to demonstrate what we are doing. So I think it's never about being anxious or nervous about extra requirements. It's actually understanding that we're in a really powerful position because we're in a good place here, but we just got to start perhaps demonstrating it going forward.
And I think that's where as I say, where we as AHDB come in, but it isn't just us singularly. And I think this would be the worst thing for us is to just try and sort of charge off on our own. We have to do this as a collaborative basis across the industry, and also kind of have open and frank discussions about it as well, because, we need to be progressing. And there's a point of speed about this that, as I didn't flippantly mean to say it in terms of it being like a commodity cycle, that it's just going to suddenly change, and it is long term, but it also doesn't mean that we've got 15 or 20 years to play at it and find an answer, because this is something that is speeding up. Impacts of climate change are being more strongly felt, etc., and that not only is affected in the environmental sphere, but also from a commodity economics perspective is highly felt. So this is definitely something whereby this is a matter of pulling all of the right people from across industry together to build that bigger, longer plan for the future, and then enact upon it. This can't just be done in isolation.
Yeah, and I think it's almost about breaking it down in terms of short, medium and long-term sort of objectives and plans. And I think, it isn't going to happen overnight, but we can already feel that the elements are creeping in. But for me, it's all about coherence. And also we get perhaps coherence when we create or we enable some of this stuff in a pre-competitive space. And I know the report starts to suggest that some of the retailers are using this as a competitive advantage, because of the current dynamics in terms of the schemes. But actually, there is an opportunity, I think, to become pre-competitive as well. And that does then ease things, I think, going forward.
Definitely. That sounds like we're finishing on a positive note, Rachel. I like that. It's a positive finish. And James powered through with his man flu as well. But you make your own honey, James. So surely you're just going to go home and nick a load of honey for the health benefits, obviously.
Copious quantities.
Rachel, James, thank you for your time. Thank you for going through what is a complex discussion, and we only kind of scratched the surface on that, especially on the environmental side. Really, there's a huge amount more we can do on that, and I'm sure we'll come back talking about it in the future. I've got to go because talking about electrics, my wife has texted me doing this podcast basically saying that something's gone bang downstairs and the electrics have gone out, so I'll have to go fix that. But we didn't mention it at the start, but we have had a mystery musical act dropping song titles in, made quite obvious, I think, at the start. If you didn't get it from the intro, I'd be disappointed, because it was Stevie Wonder, a man who I'm sure would be interested in environmental agricultural economics. Maybe we should send this to Stevie and see what he thinks.